Hey everybody, it's Courtney with Honeybee Stamps, and today we're going to be playing with the birthday candle background stencil set, and this is a set of 3 along with the party stamp and coordinating die. So this stencil set comes with 3 different stencils. So you have the full candle with the flame, you also have just the candle itself, and then another one with just the flame itself. So we're just going to be playing around, and honestly, that's exactly what I did. I just played. So for this first one here, I am going to stick down my card panel here, and this is Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, to the back part of the stencil, and this is just the candle part. I'm going to be using 3 different color inks here, and I'm using dye inks. I'm using the Simon Says stamp because they are waterproof, and you'll see why in a little bit. So I'm going to use the Audrey Blue High Dive and Wisteria ink, using a blending brush here, and they don't have to be a perfect blend. Normally when we do an ink blended background, we're really concerned about the colors blending. These inks are not made for that, so don't expect to get a perfect blend every time, but because we're using a stencil and the cutout pieces or the openings of the stencils are not very big. So if you don't get a perfect blend, you're really not going to be able to tell. So I started off with that purple color on the top, then I moved to the Audrey Blue, and then I will finish off with the High Dive. So once my candles were done, I can go ahead and remove that stencil. And I don't know whether you can see on camera, but these stencils have a A2 size outline. So it's super easy to line up if you're using an A2 size card base, or a card panel rather. But I'm leaving my tape in place. Then I can easily, very easily, line up these little flames, and that way it'll still stick to that Post-it note tape. I don't have to bother to get any more. I'm going to bring out the Duckling ink, which is a kind of like a golden yellow. I'm not going to do any multiple colors here because these flames are so tiny. But this way I don't have to worry about the ink that I've already put down kind of blending into the background, even if it's still wet, because they're 2 separate stencils. So I can remove my stencil here and you have a background. You can go as crazy as you want with this, but I kept this one pretty simple. Next, we are going to create another background here, but this time I'm going to use Pixie Spray on the back of my stencils. I just spray it on the back and let it dry for about a minute or so. Again, I'm going to line up this candle stencil, just the candle, and I'm going to use a variety of different colors here, but this time I am still going to use the Simon Says stamp inks, again, because they're waterproof, and this is where this waterproof comes into play. So I'm just going to lay down my color, this time kind of going at a diagonal just to kind of mix things up a little bit, but I'm pretty much doing the same thing. So you can certainly use Distress inks, Distress oxides, you can use the Simon Hurley Create inks, whatever inks you have on hand, but just keep in mind that if you're going to add a layer like I'm about to in just a minute, you will want to make sure that you're not using any of those inks because they are water reactive, and anytime you add moisture, including anything, it doesn't have to be just water, any kind of moisture, your inks are going to kind of bleed because that's the formula of them. That's the purpose of them. So that's the reason why I am using the waterproof ink. So definitely take a look in your stash. Like I said, you don't have to have a perfect blend. So I'm going to do the same thing with these flames. And again, I have the Pixie Spray on the back of them, on the back of the stencil. And this was a little bit more difficult it wasn't difficult to line up, but it was difficult to stick in place because as soon as I got one area lined up, it would stick down and I couldn't shift it the way I needed to shift it, but it didn't take too much. So I used that Duckling ink once again to fill in those flames. Now I'm going to bring out the 3rd stencil in the set, which this is the entire candle, including the flame. And I have this sprayed with Pixie Spray once again. I just, like I say, spray the back of it, let it sit for about a minute or so, and then I can stick that down. I am going to bring out the Glitz Glitter Gel by Gina K Designs. This is kind of like a glimmer paste. You can use glimmer paste. You can use translucent embossing paste, anything you have on in your stash that is clear. You don't want to have it a matte finish or opaque. So I went ahead and lined this up. Again, it took me a couple of minutes. It's probably not the best to use pixie spray on this. It's good enough if you hold it down with tape because it's not too intricate of a stencil, and it's kind of hard to line up a little bit when it's sticking down to your paper before you're ready for it to. So I am just using a palette knife here, and I'm going over the entire thing with this glitter gel. Now, it's a little bit chunkier than regular glimmer paste that I'm used to working with, so I did kind of have to work it into the little grooves a little bit more, but I still was able to get a pretty good coverage. I did miss that little corner that I had to go back to, but no big deal. But when you do remove your stencil, you do want to make sure that you clean it off along with your palette knife immediately, because once it starts drying, you'll never get it off. So I let this dry overnight, and in the meantime, I did play a little bit more. I made another background with kind of like an ombre. Here's the one with that glitter gel, and then I made one the same way, but I used glossy accents instead of the glitter gel. And I love this one. It's so hard to see on camera how shiny this is, and there's dimension to each one of those candles. I love how these turned out. So now we're going to create very, very simple cards. I realized when going through my card stash that I have very few birthday cards. It's just not something I make often. So I am going to add some birthday cards to my stash, as simple as they may be. So I'm starting off with this first panel. This is the first one we did with just the ink. And I cut that down the center, just making 2 strips. Next, I'm taking a scrap piece of white cardstock here, and I'm going to bring out those 3 inks that I used for my candles. And again, does not have to be a perfect blend. Don't expect to get one. But I am just basically adding some ink down to the paper. So I'm going to start off with that purple. You can see I'm pretty much going in with a light hand to start and kind of building up my color because, like I said, these inks are just not made for blending. Going to go to that bluish color and then the kind of like a turquoise color. So I have a little bit of a gradient, but it's not going to be too noticeable. But once I am somewhat happy with it anyway, I'm going to use the party die set. I'm going to cut the shadow piece from this ink blended background, and then I'll cut the word from just plain white cardstock. I can go ahead and glue down the word to that background, and you can see that it just adds a little bit of something to match the rest of my background. I'm going to put this aside to dry because I'm not going to need this right away. Then I can start assembling my 2 cards that I can make from this one background. So for the first one, I will take an white A2 size card base, and this is going to be a landscape card. And all I'm going to do is adhere this strip down to the left-hand side. I did end up trimming it down. It was just a little bit wider than I wanted it to be. And I'm also going to take a skinny strip of black cardstock. Now you can mat this completely onto a piece of black cardstock that's just a little bit larger, but why waste it when you can just give the illusion that it's matted. So I adhered that down with some Tombow Mono multi-glue, and then I'll adhere this little strip off to the right hand side, and that way it will kind of separate it and make it pop off the white card base. For my sentiment, I am just going to create some white heat embossed sentiment strips. I'm taking a piece of black cardstock. I treated that with my anti-static tool. I stamped 2 of the sentiments from the party stamp set with Versamark ink, sprinkled on some white embossing powder, and heat set that, making sure that my heat gun was heated up for about 30 seconds or so before bringing that to the paper. That minimizes the warping and makes the cutting down of these skinny little sentiment strips a little bit easier. Bringing out my little mini tonic trimmer here that I love using for sentiment strips, and cut these down just a little bit larger than the words themselves. I don't want to take up too much space. I want the left-hand side to kind of be the star of the show for this very, very clean and simple card. So I took some foam tape and popped up my sentiment right there on the right-hand side. And then just to finish it off, to add a little bit of something, because it's a clean and simple and it's a quick card, but I still want to add a little something to it. So I took some Morning Dew Nuvo drops, which are just basically clear, and added a few of those on the top and on the bottom of the sentiment. And that is it for the first one. For the second one, we're going to use that other strip that we cut down from the same background. This time I am going to make a landscape card, but I'm pretty much doing the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and glue this down to the left-hand side of the card base. Now we're going to have a little bit left over, obviously, because the background was landscape. No, I'm switching these. The background was portrait, the card is landscape. So once the glue has a couple of seconds to set, then I can just trim off any remaining that's kind of hanging off. And then we're going to bring out that word die that we have created. And this is going to go kind of diagonal. That way it'll take up a little bit more of that white space and just add a little bit of interest to it. Going to use the word let's, and I'm going to use one of the colors that I used in the background and for the shadow of the word die, and I'm just going to stamp that directly above the party sentiment. Now to add a little bit extra, and you guys have probably seen me do this before, and I love to do this with sentiment dies. I'm going to add some glossy accents just to the word. Now you want to be careful to pick out a sentiment die or word die that's thick enough to actually be able to do this. If you use one that's way too thin, you're probably just going to make a mess, even if you have a fine tip on your glossy accents. But this one is nice and thick and was super easy to do. It's going to look a little cloudy in the beginning, but once it dries, it's going to dry clear and shiny and just give a little extra dimension to the word itself. I'm going to use the same glossy accents to add a few embellishments too, because you can use them for embellishments as well. I love my glossy accents. And that's it for card number 2. Next, we are going to use this kind of like this ombre background, and I'm using the double stitched polygon die, and this is also by Honeybee. I think this is the second to smallest, and I just went ahead and cut that from the background. And I was just going to use this. I was going to keep it really simple, but it kind of got lost. I felt like I needed something else. It just wasn't enough. So I ended up taking the next size up, which is quite a bit larger, but it will still kind of frame it in. And I cut that down with some white cardstock, and we're going to add a little bit of color to that using one of the inks that I used in the background. Now, this wasn't a background that I showed you guys on camera because it really was pretty much the same thing as I did the first time, but I'm taking that ink and just coloring in the edges. I'm not worried about the center because you're not going to see the center. I just want to make sure that it looks as if I used colored cardstock when I really didn't. Very rarely will you ever see me use colored cardstock except for white and black. So once that is done, I'm also going to take another scrap piece of paper and do the same thing, and this is going to be for my die. So I'm just adding the color to it to make it look, like I said, that I used colored cardstock. So for this one, I am just using the word, just the party word, no shadow for this one. But I did cut it out 4 times. So I cut it out with where I did that ink blending to make it look like colored cardstock. And then the excess space on the top portion of that same piece of cardstock, and then 2 just from white. So I'm going to layer all of these together. Now, when you layer a bunch of pieces of cardstock together, it's going to look like you popped it up with foam tape, but there's no way in the world that I could cut foam tape this small to pop up this sentiment, nor do I want to run, fun foam with it. It's just too intricate. So I'm adding the 2 white pieces together, and then I added this one that almost looks kind of like a ombre by accident, just because I wanted to use that extra piece of paper. And I realized I liked that a lot better than the solid piece that we did our ink blending on. So once I realized I liked that more, I ended up putting this colored piece, the one that we did the full ink blending for, on the very bottom. So nobody's ever going to see it. I liked the ombre much better. I felt like that gave just enough for it to stand out from the pattern that we created. So once that's done, I can adhere everything together. So you can see that I have my white card base there. And again, this is going to be another landscape card. I'm going to glue down that large polygon and then the smaller polygon right there in the center. And you can see that it just gives enough border to make it look as if it's or if it's colored cardstock. Then I can adhere my sentiment down. Now, I can't stop myself, so I ended up adding glossy accents to this one as well. I felt like it just needed a little bit of shine to really stand out from the candles in the background. So I did the same thing, just added that glossy accents. So next we are going to, I did add a few drops of the glossy accents for some embellishment, again, because I can't stop myself. I just love my glossy accents. I need to get like cases of it. So next we're going to move on to the one that we added all that shimmer to, the glitter gel. I couldn't bear to cut this down. So what I ended up doing is I just glued this down to my card base. No border, no nothing, no dye, no cutting it down. I just glued it down. But I wanted to do a little something with the sentiment. So I'm going to do nothing too special to begin with. I am going to cut this shadow piece from some cardstock that I'm going to use the ink on just to make sure it matches the background. I'm using the Hot Mama ink, which is one of the inks that I used. Ran that through my die cutting machine and the word from a white cardstock. But I wanted to add even more glitter. But my glitter gel is done. I used the rest of it, or at least most of it, and I don't have quite enough to cover this entire thing. So I brought out my Nuvo drops, and I can't think of the name of these right now, but it's just the glitter, the clear glitter. And I'm covering up this entire shadow. And it's a little bit messy. It's not too bad in the beginning because you have something to hold, but once you get towards the end, it's a little bit more difficult because you ran out of anywhere to hold down the word. So I'm just using the tip of it to kind of spread it out to make it somewhat even. It doesn't need to be perfectly even because we're going to lay our word on top of it and it's going to squish it just a little bit. So once I had that covered, I'm going to very, very carefully place that die cut word from white cardstock right on top. I'm just using my nails to kind of very lightly place that down, and it's going to stick just like glue, but it's going to take a whole lot of time to dry. So I put that aside for a bit, and we're going to move on to this final background. And this is the one with the glossy accents, and I just cut a chunk of it off. I'm not measuring, I just eyeballed it, I just cut a chunk off and realized it just didn't stand out enough. So I'm going to do the same thing. I love to use black paper, black cardstock to really make things pop. So I cut down my panel just a little bit, and I'm taking a piece of black cardstock that's just a little bit smaller than an A2 size and just a little bit larger than the panel itself. I can adhere the panel down, just leaving a small black border on all, well, 3 sides at this point, and then I can take my trimmer and just kind of line this up. Again, I'm eyeballing it just to make sure I have a little bit of that black border showing. Then I can adhere it down to my card base, and you can see that this just makes it pop a little bit more. Now for my sentiment, I'm just keeping this one really, really simple. I'm taking the Let's Celebrate again from the party stamp set, line that up on my work surface there, pop that on an acrylic black, and stamp that down with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a fast drying pigment ink but gives great results for sentiments. Finished off with a few of those Morning Dew Nuvo drops again, and that's it for that one. Now let's go back to the glittery one, the very, very glittery one. So this is not completely dry. I let it sit for a couple of hours, but I must have added a whole lot because it's not completely dry, but I'm going to be super careful. Now I want to add the word let, so I'm going to create a very mini sentiment strip, but I don't want to wait for my ink to dry, so I'm going to do some emboss resist. I treated my cardstock with my anti-static tool, stamped it with Versamark ink, sprinkled on white embossing powder, heat set it, and then added my ink on top. But my embossing powder was not quite cool enough, and I just spread it around. And you can see that it doesn't look very nice. So I had to redo it. So I re-embossed it, let it sit for about 20 seconds or so until the embossing powder was nice and cool. And then I can add my ink, and I got much better results. Trim this down into a very, very, very small strip, and then I can adhere everything together. Now for the die cut word, because I have so much texture in the background, it doesn't want to stick right away. It will stick, it just takes a little bit of time. So I added a whole lot of glue to the back, and I kind of had to again, just use my fingernail to kind of just hold it down in place. As the glue dries, it will become a little bit more permanent, but right now it's a little bit, it's just not sticking very well. So popped up my sentiment strip, and that is it for that one. So here is a quick look at all of the cards that we created. They're very simple, but this stencil set is so much fun to play with. So as always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.